It was a typical Friday afternoon when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen and saw Mike's name flashing. Mike and I had been through a lot together during our college years, road trips, late-night cramming sessions, and more than a few adventures that we'd laugh about over beers. But since graduation, life had a way of pulling us in different directions. I answered the call, and after a few minutes of catching up, Mike cut straight to the point. "Hey, man, I've been thinking," Mike started, his voice tinged with excitement. "We need to get out of the city, you know? Just unplug and unwind for a couple of days. I found this place, Lake Paloma. It's up in the Sierra Nevadas. We could go this weekend, do some fishing, camping, just like old times." I could hear the urgency in his voice, the kind of urgency that comes from being trapped in the grind for too long. The idea of getting away, surrounded by nature and away from the endless notifications of daily life, sounded like exactly what I needed. "Lake Paloma, huh?" I asked, trying to remember if I'd ever heard of it. I hadn't. "What's the place like?" "Man, it's perfect," Mike said. "Quiet, remote, and the fishing is supposed to be incredible. I found this little spot on the far side of the lake. No one's around for miles, just us and the water. What do you say?" The spontaneity of it was appealing. We'd done crazier things on less notice back in the day. "Sounds like a plan," I said, already mentally listing the gear I'd need to pack. "What time should I be ready?" "Let's hit the road early tomorrow morning," Mike suggested. "I'll swing by your place at 6 a.m. That way, we can get there by noon and still have plenty of daylight to set up camp." After we hung up, I started gathering my gear: tent, sleeping bag, fishing rods, tackle box, and enough food to last a couple of days. As I packed, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and unease. It had been years since I'd been on a trip like this, and something about it felt different. Maybe it was the way Mike had pitched the idea, or the fact that I hadn't even heard of Lake Paloma before. But I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the anticipation of getting out of town. Before I went to bed that night, I double-checked everything. It all seemed in order: rods were in good shape, tent poles intact, and the cooler stocked with essentials. I knew Mike well enough to trust that he'd have his own gear squared away. We'd always made a good team, whether it was navigating a tricky river in a canoe or finding the best fishing spots in unknown territory. Lying in bed, I found it hard to sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the call, to the urgency in Mike's voice. He'd sounded almost desperate for this trip, like he needed it more than just a weekend away. But I pushed the thoughts aside, telling myself that I was overthinking things. After all, what could go wrong on a simple fishing trip with an old friend? I drifted off to sleep, the thought of the peaceful lake and the thrill of reeling in a big one filling my dreams. Little did I know, this trip was about to take a dark turn, leading me into the most harrowing experience of my life. I woke up to the sound of my alarm blaring at 5:30 a.m. The sun wasn't even up yet, but I felt a jolt of excitement as I threw on my clothes and grabbed my gear. By the time Mike pulled up in his old, beat-up SUV, I was already waiting on the curb, thermos of coffee in hand. The air was crisp with that early morning chill, and the sky was just beginning to lighten. Mike stepped out, grinning as he saw me. "Ready for this, man?" he asked, giving me a quick bro hug before we loaded my stuff into the back of his car. "More than ready," I replied, settling into the passenger seat. As Mike started the engine and we pulled away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The city had been weighing on me lately, the endless noise, the stress of work, the constant hustle. A few days in the mountains sounded like the perfect antidote. We hit the highway, and Mike popped in a mix of classic rock, Springsteen, Tom Petty, a little Fleetwood Mac. The familiar tunes brought back memories of road trips we'd taken during college, when we'd drive for hours just to find the perfect spot to fish or hike. We talked about those days, laughing over old stories, like the time our canoe capsized in the middle of a river, or when we got lost trying to find a hidden trail and ended up camping under the stars without a tent. As we drove, the landscape began to change. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to rolling hills, then to dense forests and winding roads. The further we went, the more the world seemed to fall away, replaced by the quiet beauty of nature. We passed through a few small towns, places that looked like they hadn't changed in decades, with weathered storefronts and empty streets. They were the kind of towns where time seemed to move slower, where people probably still knew all their neighbors by name. "Look at that place," Mike said, pointing to an old gas station as we drove by. The sign was faded, and the pumps looked like they hadn't dispensed fuel in years. "It's like something out of a ghost story." I nodded, feeling a slight chill as we continued up the mountain. The road twisted and turned, climbing higher into the Sierra Nevadas. The trees grew taller and thicker, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. The sky was a perfect blue, the kind you only see when you're far from the city's pollution. As we rounded a bend, Lake Paloma finally came into view. The sight of it took my breath away. The lake was enormous, a shimmering expanse of water that stretched out as far as the eye could see, surrounded by towering pine trees that cast long shadows on its surface. The water was so still, it looked like a giant mirror reflecting the sky and the mountains around it. There wasn't a single ripple, and the silence was almost eerie, no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just a profound, untouched calm. "Wow," I whispered, leaning forward in my seat to take it all in. "You weren't kidding, Mike. This place is amazing." Mike grinned, clearly pleased with my reaction. "Told you, man. It's like a little slice of heaven out here. We'll have the whole place to ourselves." We drove around the lake, searching for the spot Mike had scouted out online. It was on the far side, well away from the few other campsites that dotted the shoreline. The road turned to gravel, and we bumped along for a few more miles before we found it, a secluded cove with a small clearing just big enough for our tents and a fire pit. "This is it," Mike said, pulling to a stop. We got out and stood there for a moment, just soaking in the tranquility. The air was fresh, scented with pine and earth, and the only sound was the soft lapping of water against the shore. "It's perfect," I said, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. We were miles from anywhere, with nothing but the lake, the forest, and the mountains around us. It was exactly what we needed, a chance to unplug from the world, to reconnect with nature and with ourselves. But as we started unloading our gear, I couldn't shake a slight twinge of unease. Maybe it was the isolation, the way the lake seemed almost too quiet, or the way the trees loomed over us, their branches tangled like dark fingers. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all part of the adventure. After all, this was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. As we set up camp, Mike and I joked about the fish we were going to catch, the meals we'd cook over the fire, and the stories we'd tell. The excitement for the trip was building, but somewhere in the back of my mind, that small feeling of unease lingered, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. I had no idea then that this peaceful drive, this serene lake, would soon become the backdrop for something far more sinister than either of us could have imagined. After circling the lake for what felt like hours, we finally found the perfect spot, a remote clearing on the far side of Lake Paloma, tucked away from the handful of other campers we had seen. The place was secluded, surrounded by a thick wall of pine trees that seemed to close us off from the rest of the world. It had an eerie charm, like a place frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, soft underfoot, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of the forest. "This is it," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb the stillness. He looked around, nodding with approval. "This is exactly what I was hoping for." I had to agree. There was something almost magical about the spot. The lake stretched out before us, its surface shimmering in the late afternoon light, perfectly still except for the occasional ripple from a fish jumping. The trees around us cast long shadows, giving the place a calm, almost sacred feel. It was the kind of spot you'd imagine finding in a nature documentary, pristine, untouched, and completely cut off from civilization. We wasted no time setting up camp. Mike pulled out the tent while I started clearing the space for the fire pit. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lake. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was the kind of silence that you could lose yourself in, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only people left on Earth. As we worked, we fell into a comfortable rhythm, our years of camping experience kicking in. The tent went up quickly, a sturdy two-man setup with enough room for both of us and our gear. We picked a spot near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the water that we could hear the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. It was the perfect spot to wake up to in the morning, with the sun rising over the mountains and reflecting off the water. Next, we built the campfire. We gathered rocks to form a circle and stacked up dry wood that Mike had brought from home. The fire would be essential, not just for warmth, but for cooking the fish we planned to catch. We had enough provisions to last us the weekend, but nothing beats fresh-caught fish cooked over an open flame. With everything set up, we took a moment to admire our work. The tent stood firm, the fire pit ready to go, and our gear neatly organized by the campsite. The place felt like a second home already, a sanctuary in the wilderness. "Not bad, huh?" Mike said, a satisfied grin on his face. "Not bad at all," I replied, feeling a wave of contentment. It was the kind of feeling that only comes when you're completely immersed in nature, away from the stresses of everyday life. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. But the day wasn't over yet. With the camp set up, we decided to scout out the lake for the best fishing spots. Mike had brought along a topographical map of the area, showing the lake's depth and underwater terrain. We walked along the shoreline, checking out the spots where the water was calm and deep, perfect for catching bass and trout. As we explored, the sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lake and turning the sky a deep orange. As we rounded a bend in the shoreline, we came across a small, rocky outcrop that jutted into the lake. The water here was clear and deep, and the rocks created natural pools that were teeming with fish. It was the kind of spot every angler dreams of finding, quiet, secluded, and brimming with potential. "This is it," Mike said, nodding toward the water. "This is where we'll make our first cast tomorrow." We lingered at the spot for a while, imagining the thrill of reeling in a big one, the weight of the fish fighting on the line. The anticipation was building, the excitement of the adventure ahead making us feel like kids again. We were completely unaware of the tension that was slowly creeping in, like the shadows lengthening around us. As we headed back to camp, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the temperature began to drop. A cool breeze swept through the campsite, rustling the trees and sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter, but didn't think much of it. We had firewood, warm sleeping bags, and enough adrenaline to keep us going. Back at camp, we lit the fire and sat around it, watching the flames dance and crackle. The darkness closed in around us, but the firelight kept it at bay, casting a warm, flickering glow over the clearing. We talked about our plans for the next day, about the fish we were going to catch and the meals we'd cook over the fire. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, with nothing but the promise of a great day of fishing ahead. But as the night wore on and the fire burned lower, that sense of unease from earlier began to creep back in. The breeze that had seemed refreshing earlier now felt colder, more insistent. The trees around us, once comforting, now loomed over the campfire like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. We paid it no mind, chalking it up to the natural sounds of the forest and the excitement of being out in the wild. After all, we were here to relax, to escape from the noise and stress of the world. Little did we know, the real adventure was just beginning, and it was far from the peaceful retreat we had imagined. Night settled over Lake Paloma like a heavy blanket, the deepening darkness swallowing the last hints of daylight. The campfire crackled softly, its flames casting a flickering glow on the trees around us. Mike and I had long since finished our dinner, canned beans and sausages, cooked over the fire, and were now sitting in comfortable silence, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered. But as the fire burned lower, the warmth of the day seemed to vanish with it. The air grew colder, and the forest around us became strangely still. The usual sounds of the wilderness, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, were conspicuously absent. It was the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that made you feel like the world had suddenly emptied out, leaving you completely alone. I tried to shake off the unease that was slowly creeping in, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After all, we were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but trees and water. This was exactly what we had wanted: peace, quiet, a break from the chaos of everyday life. But as the night wore on, the silence only deepened. Mike had already retired to his tent, mumbling something about getting up early to catch the morning bite. I lingered by the dying fire for a while longer, poking at the embers with a stick, trying to stave off the growing sense of unease that was gnawing at my gut. The stars were out in full force, their cold, distant light barely penetrating the dense canopy of trees above. The moon hung low in the sky, a thin crescent that cast long, eerie shadows across the campsite. Finally, I decided it was time to call it a night. I doused the fire with a bucket of water, watching as the last embers hissed and sputtered out. The darkness closed in around me, thick and oppressive, as I made my way to my tent. The zipper of the tent door rasped loudly in the silence as I climbed inside and zipped it up behind me. I crawled into my sleeping bag, pulling it up to my chin, but no matter how much I tried to get comfortable, sleep wouldn't come. The quiet was almost suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent in the stillness. Every rustle of fabric, every breath I took seemed magnified, echoing in the small space of the tent. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Around midnight, just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it, a faint noise, barely audible at first, but enough to jolt me fully awake. It was the sound of twigs snapping, the unmistakable crunch of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush. I lay perfectly still, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe a deer wandering through the woods. But then I heard it again, louder this time, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving closer to the tent. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I wanted to dismiss it as my imagination, but the sounds were too clear, too purposeful to ignore. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was trying to be quiet, but the stillness of the night betrayed them. Every step they took, every branch that cracked underfoot, sent a shiver down my spine. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my senses on high alert, every nerve in my body taut with fear. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities: an animal, a lost hiker, maybe even a bear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. There was something else out there, something that didn't belong in these woods. I thought about waking Mike, but the idea of unzipping the tent door and exposing myself to whatever was out there filled me with dread. Instead, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me, and tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing, willing myself to calm down. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the camp, moving slowly, almost methodically, as if whoever it was knew exactly where we were and was watching us. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, and every now and then, a faint rustling, like someone brushing against the branches of a tree. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, every muscle in my body tense. I had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The thin fabric of the tent seemed like a pathetic barrier between me and whatever was out there, and the darkness beyond it felt like a living, breathing entity, pressing in on me from all sides. Eventually, the sounds began to fade, the footsteps growing fainter as they moved away from the campsite. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. It was a long time before I finally fell asleep, and when I did, it was a restless, uneasy sleep filled with dark dreams. The sense of unease stayed with me, a constant, nagging feeling that we weren't as alone out there as we had thought. The night stretched on, the darkness closing in tighter around us, and all I could do was wait for the dawn, hoping that whatever was out there would disappear with the first light of day. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy and disoriented, the remnants of a restless night clinging to me like a heavy fog. The sunlight filtering through the trees was harsh after the long hours of darkness, and it took me a moment to remember where I was. The events of the night before came rushing back, the eerie silence, the footsteps, the overwhelming sense of being watched. I lay there for a few moments, listening for any signs of movement outside the tent. The only sounds were the chirping of birds and the soft rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. When I finally mustered the energy to unzip the tent and step outside, I found Mike already up, crouched by the fire pit, stirring a pot of coffee. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the crisp morning air, but it did little to lift the lingering unease that hung over me. "Morning," Mike said, glancing up as I approached. There was a hint of tiredness in his voice, and I wondered if he'd slept as poorly as I had. "Morning," I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I hesitated for a moment before asking, "Did you hear anything weird last night?" Mike paused, his hand hovering over the pot. He didn't meet my eyes as he answered. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, footsteps, maybe?" I said, trying to sound casual. Like someone, or something, was walking around our campsite. Mike finally looked up, his expression guarded. He shrugged, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Probably just animals," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "This place is crawling with wildlife." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling me everything. There was something off about the way he brushed it aside, like he didn't want to talk about it. I decided not to push it, though, figuring that the isolation was getting to both of us. Instead, I took the mug of coffee he handed me and tried to focus on the day ahead. We spent the next hour or so gathering our gear and getting ready for a full day of fishing. Mike seemed eager to get out on the water, and I followed his lead, hoping that the familiar routine would help me shake the lingering unease. We grabbed our rods, tackle boxes, and the cooler, then made our way down to the lake. The lake was even more beautiful in the morning light, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. There wasn't a single ripple to disturb the water, and the silence was almost peaceful after the events of the night. Almost. We found a spot along the shore where the water was deep and clear, the perfect place to cast our lines. Mike went ahead and set up his rod, casting his line out into the still water with practiced ease. I followed suit, but my mind wasn't fully on the task. The silence that had felt oppressive last night now seemed almost too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We fished in silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional splash as a fish jumped or the soft buzz of a fly skimming the water. But as the morning wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the same feeling I'd had last night, the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking our every move. I glanced across the lake, letting my eyes wander over the landscape. The far side of the lake was dense with trees, their dark forms rising like a wall of shadows. And then, through the thick foliage, I saw it, a small, weathered cabin, barely visible through the trees. It looked old, almost abandoned, with a sagging roof and walls darkened by years of exposure to the elements. I frowned, not remembering seeing the cabin when we'd scouted the area the day before. It blended into the surroundings so well that it was easy to miss unless you were looking for it. As I squinted, trying to get a better look, something caught my eye, a shadow moving inside, quick and fleeting, like someone or something had just passed by the window. "Mike," I said quietly, still staring at the cabin. "Do you see that?" Mike looked up from his rod, following my gaze across the lake. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the cabin. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I see it. Did you know there was a cabin over there?" I asked, my voice low. Mike shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't notice it yesterday." He paused, then added, "Maybe it's an old fishing cabin, something left behind from when this area was more populated." "Maybe," I said, though something about the cabin didn't sit right with me. The way it was hidden away, almost like it was trying to avoid being seen. And then there was the shadow, the brief glimpse of movement that made my skin crawl. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, neither of us making a move to reel in our lines or cast again. The shadow I'd seen nagged at me, an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. It could have been anything, a trick of the light, an animal moving through the trees, but something about it felt wrong. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "Let's keep fishing," he said, his voice steady but a little too forced. "We came here to relax, right?" "Yeah," I agreed, though the words felt hollow. I cast my line out again, trying to focus on the water, on the rhythmic motions of fishing that usually brought me peace. But my mind kept drifting back to that cabin, to the shadow inside, to the strange events of the night before. We fished in silence for the rest of the morning, but the tranquility that had drawn us to Lake Paloma was gone. It had been replaced by a gnawing sense of unease, by the feeling that something wasn't right, that we were no longer alone in these woods. And even though we didn't speak of it again, I knew Mike felt it too. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing across the lake, his eyes fixed on the spot where the cabin stood hidden among the trees. The edge in his voice, the tension in his movements, it was clear that the peace we had come here to find had been shattered. We both knew that something, or someone, was out there, watching us. And no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, we couldn't escape the feeling that our quiet fishing trip was about to take a darker turn. The hours slipped by as we fished in relative silence, our focus split between the water in front of us and the unsettling thoughts that lingered in the back of our minds. Despite the tension, there was something meditative about casting our lines and waiting for a bite, the repetitive motions helping to push aside the unease, if only for a while. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the lake, and the morning wore on with only the occasional murmur between us. As the day stretched into afternoon, we moved from spot to spot along the shore, trying our luck in different areas. The fish were elusive, though, and our coolers remained empty. I could tell Mike was getting frustrated. His usual enthusiasm for fishing was dampened by the eerie atmosphere, and the lack of bites wasn't helping. But then, just as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, it happened. Mike was standing on a rocky outcrop a few yards from me, his line trailing lazily in the water, when suddenly his rod bent sharply, the tip dipping dangerously close to the surface. "Whoa, I've got something!" Mike yelled, his voice breaking the heavy silence. I looked over just in time to see his line go taut, the reel spinning wildly as whatever was on the other end fought back. "Hang on," I called, scrambling over the rocks to get closer. Mike's face was a mix of concentration and excitement as he wrestled with the rod, trying to keep the fish from breaking the line. "This one's huge," Mike grunted, bracing himself as the fish tugged violently, pulling line from the reel in quick, sharp bursts. He fought back, reeling in what he could, only for the fish to surge again, putting up a fierce fight. For what felt like an eternity, Mike battled the fish, his muscles straining as he worked to tire it out. The tension in the line was palpable, every movement of the rod a delicate balance between reeling in too quickly and letting the fish run too far. I watched, holding my breath, ready to jump in and help if needed. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the fish began to tire. Mike seized the opportunity, reeling it in inch by inch until the massive trout broke the surface, its silvery scales glinting in the fading light. It was enormous, easily the biggest fish either of us had ever caught, and it thrashed violently as Mike pulled it closer to the shore. "Get the net!" Mike shouted, and I sprang into action, grabbing the net from the cooler and rushing over. I carefully maneuvered the net under the fish, and with a quick scoop, we had it. "Got it!" I yelled, hauling the fish onto the rocks. It flopped around wildly, its gills flaring as it gasped for air. Mike dropped his rod and grabbed the fish with both hands, struggling to hold onto it as it thrashed in his grip. "Look at the size of this thing!" Mike exclaimed, his face splitting into a triumphant grin. The trout was massive, easily over 20 inches long, and its body was thick and muscular from years of swimming in the deep waters of Lake Paloma. We stood there for a moment, both of us grinning like kids, the thrill of the catch momentarily pushing aside the unease that had been hanging over us all day. It was a perfect moment, the kind of moment we'd come out here for, the kind that made all the strange happenings seem trivial in comparison. But as we celebrated our catch, the wind began to pick up, rustling the trees around us and sending ripples across the surface of the lake. The warm, golden light of the afternoon had faded into the softer hues of dusk, and the shadows were growing longer, darker, as the sun dipped closer to the horizon. That familiar feeling of unease started to creep back in, stronger this time. The wind, which had been gentle earlier, now had a sharp edge to it, and it carried with it a chill that seemed to settle into my bones. The trees swayed ominously, their branches creaking in the wind, and the lake, which had been so calm all day, now seemed restless, its surface churning with the breeze. I looked around, scanning the shoreline, the dense line of trees that hemmed us in, and the far side of the lake where the cabin stood hidden among the pines. The shadowy figure from earlier was nowhere to be seen, but the feeling that we were being watched had intensified, like eyes were following our every move, hidden just out of sight. "Maybe we should pack it up," I suggested, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "It's getting late." Mike nodded, the grin fading from his face as he too looked around, suddenly more aware of the encroaching darkness. "Yeah, let's head back to camp." We quickly packed up our gear, the excitement of the catch overshadowed by the growing sense of unease. The fish went into the cooler, the rods were stowed, and we began the walk back to our campsite. The wind whipped through the trees, the branches swaying and snapping as we trudged along the rocky shore. The sky above was a deepening shade of purple, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the mountains. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig seemed magnified, echoing in the growing darkness. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, emerge from the shadows, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the wind, and the deepening night. We finally made it back to camp, and as soon as we crossed the threshold of the clearing, I felt a strange sense of relief, like we'd narrowly escaped something dangerous. We set our gear down and lit the campfire, its flames flickering weakly against the cool night air. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It lingered, hanging over us like a dark cloud, a constant reminder that we weren't alone out here. Even as we cooked the massive trout over the fire and tried to focus on the mundane tasks of preparing dinner, that sense of unease remained, growing stronger with every passing minute. The wind continued to howl through the trees, the shadows closing in around us as night fell completely. And as we sat there, eating our meal in uneasy silence, I couldn't help but feel that something was out there, hiding in the darkness, watching us. The thrill of the catch had worn off, replaced by a gnawing fear that we were being hunted, by what, I couldn't say. But one thing was certain, our peaceful fishing trip was turning into something far more sinister, and I had a feeling that whatever was out there in the woods wasn't done with us yet. The fire had burned down to embers by the time we finally crawled into our tents, exhausted from the day but still on edge. Despite the heavy meal and the long hours of fishing, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves outside my tent made me jump, my mind racing with thoughts of what, or who, might be out there in the darkness. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving outside my tent. My heart leaped into my throat, and I lay there, paralyzed, listening as the noises grew louder, closer. The wind had died down, leaving the night unnervingly still, and in that silence, the sounds outside seemed even more amplified. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a twig, the soft, deliberate shuffle of feet moving around the campsite. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling as I gripped it tightly. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, to stay inside the tent, but I had to know what was out there. With my heart pounding in my ears, I slowly unzipped the tent door just enough to peer outside, shining the flashlight in a wide arc. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing near the dying embers of our campfire was the silhouette of a man. He was tall, his figure outlined by the dim, flickering light of the fire. His back was to me, his head slightly bowed as he stared into the fading flames, motionless. I couldn't make out any details of his face or clothing, just the dark outline of a person who shouldn't have been there. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I watched him. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another camper? A ranger? But something about the way he stood there, so still and silent, filled me with a deep, primal fear. I wanted to call out to Mike, to warn him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just watched in terror as the figure slowly straightened and began to turn. The light from the fire flickered across his face, but it was still shrouded in shadow, his features hidden from view. And then, without a word, he started walking toward the trees at the edge of our camp. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost as if he was gliding across the ground. He didn't make a sound as he moved, disappearing into the thick darkness of the forest. I sat there, flashlight still in hand, too shocked to move. The night had swallowed him up so completely, it was as if he had never been there at all. The only evidence of his presence was the lingering feeling of dread that hung heavy in the air. Finally, I snapped out of my paralysis and crawled out of the tent, my legs shaking as I stood up. I swung the flashlight around the campsite, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of the man. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The fire was almost out, just a few glowing embers left, casting weak shadows across the ground. "Mike!" I hissed, my voice trembling. I ran over to his tent and shook it. "Mike, wake up!" It took a moment, but finally, I heard the rustling of a sleeping bag and the groggy sound of Mike's voice. What is it?" he mumbled, clearly annoyed at being woken up. "There was someone here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A man. He was standing by the fire." Mike's tent unzipped quickly, and he emerged, looking groggy but alert. "What are you talking about? Did you see him?" "Yes," I said, my voice low and urgent. "He was right there, by the fire. I don't know where he went, but he walked into the woods." Mike glanced around the campsite, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. He grabbed his own flashlight and swept the beam over the trees, the rocks, and the lake, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Mike asked, though there was a tension in his voice that told me he wasn't as skeptical as he sounded. "I'm sure," I insisted. "I saw him, Mike. He was real." Mike's eyes darted back to the forest, his expression hardening. "All right," he said, his voice low. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It could have been a camper from another site, maybe someone got lost." "Maybe," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. Everything about the figure had felt wrong, his silence, his stillness, the way he vanished into the darkness without a trace. Mike glanced around once more, then nodded toward the fire. "Let's get the fire going again," he said, already gathering some of the wood we'd collected earlier. "No point trying to sleep now. We'll keep watch for a while, see if anyone comes back." I didn't argue. Together, we stoked the fire until it was blazing again, the flames chasing away the shadows that had crept in around us. We sat by the fire, side by side, our flashlights at the ready, but neither of us spoke. The silence of the forest was heavy, almost oppressive, as if it was closing in around us, waiting for something. Hours passed, but the man didn't return. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. But the unease lingered, and I knew that neither of us would be sleeping much that night. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the tension started to ease, just a little. But the fear hadn't gone away, not completely. It clung to me like a shadow, a constant reminder that we weren't alone out here. Whatever, or whoever, had visited our campsite that night was still out there, somewhere in the forest, watching and waiting. And as the sun rose, casting its first rays over Lake Paloma, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was just beginning. When dawn finally broke, the golden light of morning did little to dispel the dread that had settled deep in my bones. The events of the night before felt like a bad dream, but the gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach told me it had been all too real. I crawled out of my tent, stiff and exhausted, and immediately looked around the campsite, half expecting to see the mysterious figure lurking in the shadows. But the campsite was empty, eerily calm in the morning light. The fire had burned down to a pile of ashes, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. It was a stark contrast to the tension of the night, but the sense of unease still hung in the air, thick and heavy. I noticed that Mike's tent was already open, but he was nowhere to be seen. My heart skipped a beat as 1,000 possibilities flashed through my mind. What if the man had come back? What if Mike had gone looking for him and hadn't returned? Panic started to creep in, and I grabbed my flashlight, even though the sun was already up. I scanned the area, calling out for Mike, my voice trembling. "Mike! Where are you?" I heard movement near the shore, and I hurried toward the lake, my heart pounding. As I emerged from the trees, I saw Mike standing at the water's edge, staring out across the lake. The sight of him, standing there unharmed, should have been a relief, but the look on his face sent a chill down my spine. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and his eyes were wide with a mix of fear and something else, something I couldn't quite place. When he finally turned to look at me, I could see that he was shaken, more shaken than I had ever seen him before. "I saw him too," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between us, confirming what I had feared the most. The man from the night before wasn't just a figment of my imagination, he was real, and Mike had seen him too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The implications of what we had seen, the reality of our situation, were too overwhelming to put into words. Finally, I broke the silence. "Did he say anything to you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Mike shook his head slowly. "No. I just saw him standing there, by the fire, like you said. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. And then, he was gone." We stood there, the weight of the night's events pressing down on us. There was no denying it now, something was very wrong, and we were in the middle of it. "We need to find out who he is," I said, trying to inject some resolve into my voice. "Or at least what he wants." Mike nodded, though his face was still pale, his eyes distant. "There's that cabin," he said, glancing across the lake. "The one we saw yesterday. Maybe it belongs to him, or maybe we'll find something that can tell us what's going on." The thought of approaching that cabin, of what we might find there, filled me with dread. But we couldn't just ignore what had happened. We needed answers, and the cabin was our only lead. We quickly gathered our gear, neither of us saying much as we packed up. The air was thick with tension, every small sound making us jumpy. Even the daylight didn't feel safe anymore. We made our way around the lake, following the shoreline until we reached the area where we had first spotted the cabin. As we got closer, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The trees were denser here, the sunlight barely piercing through the canopy. It felt like we were stepping into another world, a place where the rules of reality didn't quite apply. The cabin came into view, half hidden by the underbrush. Up close, it was even more dilapidated than it had appeared from across the lake. The wood was weathered and dark, the roof sagging, and the windows were clouded with dirt and grime. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. But as we approached, I noticed signs that contradicted its outward appearance. The door, though old, was slightly ajar, creaking gently in the breeze. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, the grass trampled down as if someone had been moving around recently. And there was a faint smell in the air, a mixture of musty decay and something sharper, more chemical, like gasoline. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand on the door, heart pounding. "You ready?" I asked, my voice shaky. Mike nodded, though he looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Together, we pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was a mess. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shards of glass, and piles of dirt that had blown in through the cracks in the walls. But amid the decay, there were signs of recent activity. Empty food cans were scattered around, some with labels that looked relatively new. A dirty, rolled-up sleeping bag was shoved into a corner, covered in stains. The air was thick with dust, but it was clear that someone had been here, and not too long ago. But the most unsettling discovery was on the far wall, where a crude wooden table stood. On it was a map of the area, an old, weathered map with the edges frayed from use. I leaned in closer, my stomach twisting as I realized what I was looking at. The map had several areas marked, including the lake and the surrounding woods, but one spot was circled in thick, black ink, our campsite. Mike saw it too, and his face went even paler. "He's been watching us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew exactly where we were. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I stared at the map. The implications were terrifying. This man, whoever he was, had been planning something, tracking us, maybe even luring us here. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice urgent. "Now." Mike didn't argue. We turned to leave, but as we did, something on the ground caught my eye. It was a small, black object, half hidden under the table. I reached down and picked it up, my hand shaking. It was a digital camera, covered in dust, but still intact. I turned it on, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the photos. The first few were harmless enough, pictures of the lake, the forest, even some wildlife. But as I continued, my heart sank. The photos became more sinister, showing our campsite from a distance, then closer, zooming in on Mike and me as we fished, ate, and sat by the fire. The last few photos were taken in the dead of night, showing us asleep in our tents, completely unaware. I dropped the camera, my stomach turning with fear and disgust. This wasn't just a random drifter, this was someone who had been watching us, stalking us, waiting for the right moment to make his move. "We need to go," I said again, my voice barely a whisper. "We're not safe here." Mike nodded, his face ashen. We didn't waste any more time. We turned and fled from the cabin, our footsteps pounding on the rotting wood floor. As we burst out into the daylight, the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees taller and darker than before. We didn't stop running until we reached the shore of the lake, gasping for breath, hearts racing. There was no longer any doubt in our minds. Something was very wrong at Lake Paloma, and the man we had seen was far more dangerous than we had imagined. We had to get out of there, and fast, before we became his next victims. The run back to our campsite was a blur, our fear driving us faster than we'd ever moved before. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like dark sentinels, their branches clawing at us as we tore through the underbrush. My mind raced, the image of that map with our campsite circled in black ink seared into my memory. We had to get out of there, but first, we needed our gear, our keys, our phones, anything that would help us escape. As we broke through the tree line and into our campsite, my heart dropped into my stomach. There, crouched by our tent, was the man. He was rummaging through our things, his movements frantic and jerky, like a wild animal scavenging for food. The sight of him in the daylight was jarring. He was even more terrifying up close, his appearance more unkempt and feral than I had imagined. His clothes were dirty and torn, barely hanging onto his gaunt frame. His hair was long and matted, falling in greasy tangles around his face, which was covered in dirt and stubble. But it was his eyes that struck me the most, wide, bloodshot, and filled with a crazed intensity that made my blood run cold. For a moment, we were all frozen in place, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Then the man looked up, and our eyes locked. There was a brief flicker of something, recognition, maybe fear, but then he moved, fast as lightning, grabbing a small bag and bolting toward the woods. "Hey!" Mike shouted, but the man was already running. Without thinking, we gave chase, adrenaline surging through our veins. The forest blurred around us as we sprinted after him, the sound of our pounding footsteps mingling with the rustle of leaves and the snapping of branches. The man was fast, his movements erratic as he weaved through the trees, but fear and desperation fueled our pursuit. We couldn't let him get away, not after everything we had discovered, not after he had invaded our camp and watched us so closely. We had to stop him. As we closed the distance, I could see him glancing back over his shoulder, his eyes wide with panic. He was getting tired, his pace slowing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. We were almost on him when he suddenly turned, skidding to a stop in a small clearing. His wild eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere left to run. He faced us, and for the first time, I got a clear look at him. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and his clothes hung off him like rags. He looked like he hadn't eaten or slept properly in weeks, maybe months. But there was something else, too, something darker. His eyes were filled with a kind of madness, a wild, unpredictable energy that made my blood run cold. "Stay back," he snarled, his voice low and raspy. His hand shot into his bag, and before we could react, he pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the dappled sunlight, and he held it out in front of him, his hand trembling. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will." We stopped in our tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. Mike and I exchanged a quick glance, silently communicating our next move. This man was dangerous, but we couldn't let him go. Not after everything he'd done. "Calm down," Mike said, his voice steady, though I could hear the underlying tension. He raised his hand slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. "We don't want any trouble, okay? Just put the knife down, and we can talk about this." But the man didn't lower the knife. His eyes flicked between us, his grip tightening on the handle. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "You don't know what it's like out here, alone, always watching." I could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear that had driven him to this point. But I also saw something else, something dangerous and unpredictable. He was on the edge, and it wouldn't take much to push him over. Before I could react, Mike lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab the man's wrist. The man yelped in surprise, and for a moment, they struggled, the knife flashing dangerously between them. My heart leaped into my throat as I watched, helpless, the two of them grappling in the clearing, their movements fast and violent. But Mike was stronger. He twisted the man's wrist with a quick, practiced motion, and the knife clattered to the ground. The man cried out in pain, but Mike didn't let go. He forced the man to the ground, pinning him there as I rushed forward, grabbing the knife and tossing it out of reach. The man thrashed and struggled, but he was no match for Mike's strength. Within moments, Mike had him subdued, tying his hands with a length of rope we had brought along in our gear. The man whimpered and muttered under his breath, his wild eyes darting around, but he didn't fight back anymore. The struggle had drained him, and he lay there, panting and defeated. I grabbed our radio from the tent and quickly called the Rangers, my hands shaking as I relayed what had happened. They responded quickly, telling us to stay put and that they were on their way. When the Rangers arrived, their faces were grim. They took one look at the man, now tied up and sitting sullenly by the fire, and exchanged knowing glances. "He's been on our radar for a while," one of the Rangers said as they cuffed the man and hauled him to his feet. "A drifter, dangerous, known to cause trouble. You're lucky you found him when you did." Mike and I exchanged a glance, the gravity of the situation sinking in. We had come to Lake Paloma for a simple fishing trip, but it had turned into something far more dangerous than we could have ever imagined. The Rangers escorted the man to their truck, and as they loaded him in, I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over me. It was over. The danger was gone. As the truck pulled away, the ranger who had spoken to us turned back, his expression serious. "You boys were lucky," he said. "It could have ended a lot worse. We'll take care of him from here, but I'd suggest you pack up and head home. This lake, it has a way of attracting trouble." Mike and I didn't need to be told twice. We packed up our gear in record time, the adrenaline still pumping through our veins. The campsite that had seemed so peaceful just a day ago now felt like a place we needed to escape from. As we drove away from Lake Paloma, the trees closing in behind us, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The lake shimmered in the morning light, as serene and beautiful as ever. But now, I knew there was something darker beneath the surface, something that we had only just escaped. We were lucky to be alive. But I knew that the memories of what had happened there would stay with us for a long time to come. The next morning dawned with an eerie calm that felt completely out of place after the chaos of the previous day. The early morning mist clung to the surface of Lake Paloma, shrouding it in a ghostly blanket that made the world around us seem distant, unreal. The birds chirped in the trees, the sun slowly rose above the horizon, casting golden light across the water, and for a moment, it was easy to forget the terror that had gripped us just hours before. But the tranquility was deceptive. Beneath the peaceful exterior, there was a tension that neither Mike nor I could shake. As we moved about the campsite, packing up our gear with robotic efficiency, we exchanged few words. The adrenaline of the chase and the confrontation had worn off, leaving us drained and jittery. The thrill of the fishing trip, the excitement that had brought us here, was gone, replaced by a lingering fear that hung over us like a dark cloud. I kept replaying the events in my mind, the man's wild eyes, the knife glinting in the sunlight, the moment when Mike had disarmed him, and the ranger's grim warnings. It was hard to believe that all of this had happened in such a short span of time, that a weekend meant for relaxation and escape had turned into a nightmare we barely escaped from. As we took down the tent and loaded the last of our things into the SUV, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The campsite, once a place of refuge, now felt tainted, as if the violence that had occurred there had left a permanent mark. The trees, the lake, even the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of what we had experienced. Mike and I worked in silence, both lost in our thoughts. I could tell he was struggling with the same emotions I was: relief, fear, disbelief. We had come to Lake Paloma seeking peace, but instead, we had found something much darker. And now, all we wanted was to put as much distance between ourselves and this place as possible. Finally, everything was packed, and we stood by the lake one last time, taking in the scene. The water was as still as glass, the only movement the faint ripples caused by a breeze that had picked up. The sun was higher now, its warmth a sharp contrast to the cold fear that still lingered in my chest. It was a beautiful morning, the kind you'd normally savor on a fishing trip, but neither of us could appreciate it. "Ready?" Mike asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, but before turning to go, I took one last look at the lake. In the daylight, it was hard to believe that such a serene place could hold so much menace. But I knew that the memories of what had happened here would stay with me forever. The sight of that shadowy figure standing by the campfire, the chase through the woods, the moment of sheer terror when the knife had flashed in the man's hand, these were images that would haunt my dreams for years to come. We climbed into the SUV and started the engine. The rumble of the motor was a welcome sound, grounding us in the present, in the safety of our vehicle. As we pulled away from the campsite, the gravel crunching under the tires, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that we were leaving, but also a deep unease that we had come so close to something terrible. The drive back down the mountain was quiet, the silence between us filled with unspoken thoughts. We didn't listen to music this time, the classic rock that had accompanied us on the way up now felt out of place. Instead, we drove in silence, each lost in our own reflections. I thought about how quickly everything had changed. Just a day ago, we had been excited, full of plans for the weekend, eager to fish, to relax, to escape from the pressures of our lives. And now, that excitement had been replaced by a sober realization of how close we had come to danger, how easily things could have gone horribly wrong. Mike glanced over at me occasionally, as if to make sure I was still there, still okay. I did the same, both of us needing the reassurance that we had made it through this together, that we were still safe, still alive. But the tension in the car was palpable, a constant reminder of the fears that had gripped us so tightly. As the hours passed and we got closer to home, the tension began to ease, but it never fully went away. We were safe now, far from Lake Paloma, but the experience had left a mark on us. It was the kind of thing that changes you, that makes you see the world a little differently. The realization that danger can lurk even in the most peaceful places, that something as simple as a fishing trip can turn into a fight for survival. By the time we reached the city, the sun was high in the sky, and the familiar sights and sounds of civilization started to drown out the memories of the lake. But as we pulled into my driveway and began to unload the gear, I knew that this trip was something we would never forget. "Take care, man," Mike said as we stood by the car, the weight of everything we'd been through hanging between us. "You too," I replied, offering a weak smile. We both knew that things wouldn't be the same after this. We had shared something that would forever link us to that place, to that weekend. And even as we tried to return to our normal lives, the shadows of Lake Paloma would linger in the background, a reminder of how close we had come to something dark and dangerous. As Mike drove away, I stood there for a moment, letting the silence of my neighborhood wash over me. It was a comforting silence, familiar and safe. But in the back of my mind, the image of the shadowy figure by the campfire flickered like a distant memory, refusing to fade away completely. I knew that whenever I thought of Lake Paloma, it wouldn't be the calm waters or the beautiful scenery that came to mind. It would be the fear, the sense of being watched, the thrill of the chase, and the terrifying realization of how close we had come to disaster. It had been a weekend meant for escape, a chance to unwind and reconnect with nature. But instead, it had turned into a haunting memory that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers lie not in the wilds of nature, but in the darkness that lurks within the human soul. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?